It didn't flinch when a drunk man cursed in his face, but when that man urinated on the boots that carried 40 years of military service, he acted. It was just after 5:00 p.m. outside Buckingham Palace. The air was cold enough to see your breath, and the crowd had started to thin. Most people didn't notice the gray-haired guard standing in full uniform beneath the Union Jack, but they should have. That man was Caleb Whitaker, a 60-year-old former U.S. Marine with 2 tours in Afghanistan, and the kind of stillness that comes only from battle-tested patience. He wasn't standing there for show. He was standing for something far bigger, for every soldier who ever held a post with pride. What happened next would turn stomachs, raise eyebrows, and leave one man whimpering in a puddle of his own making. If you believe in honor, discipline, and standing your ground, hit like, drop your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe to Guard Royals. Help us reach 1,000 subscribers who still believe respect must be earned and defended. Stick around till the end. What Caleb does at minute 14 will make you stand up and say, "That's how a soldier answers disrespect." The insult wasn't in the words, it was in what he did next. Caleb Whitaker had been called worse during his years in combat. He'd faced enemy fire, survived roadside bombs, and held dying men in his arms. So when the drunken man in the Manchester jersey began hurling slurred insults at him outside Buckingham Palace, Caleb didn't blink. His eyes stayed forward, boots planted, shoulders squared like every Marine was taught. But the man didn't stop at words. He circled Caleb like a jackal, puffing his chest and laughing at the stillness. "You old war dog," he spat. "Bet you ain't got the guts to even blink." He jabbed a finger inches from Caleb's chest. Then came the beer, poured slowly, deliberately, over Caleb's shoulder like cheap gasoline on polished brass. Some in the crowd gasped. One elderly tourist said aloud, "That man's wearing a soldier's history." Still, Caleb didn't move. The crowd shifted. Phones came out. A teenage boy looked up at his grandfather and asked, "Why's he letting him do that?" The old man whispered back, "He's not. He's just waiting." Then the drunk made his fatal mistake. With a smug grin, he unzipped his pants. The stream hit Caleb's boots with a hiss. A final line crossed, and somewhere behind Caleb's dead straight stare, something changed. There's silence, then shame, then swift justice. The moment that stream hit his boots, a ripple moved through the crowd like a cold wind before a storm. Some turned away in disgust. Others couldn't look away. Caleb's boots, once polished to a mirror sheen, now darkened with the wet stain of deliberate disrespect. But still, Caleb didn't move. Not yet. The drunk? Let's call him what he was now, a disgrace named Nico. Zipped up with a smirk, fully expecting no consequence. "What, not gonna flinch?" he taunted. "Bet they trained that reaction right out of you, old man." A group of American tourists near the gate stood frozen. One older woman clutched a small flag she'd bought from a vendor. "That man wore that uniform for us," she said, her voice shaking. Then came the final straw. Nico raised his arms mockingly and saluted Caleb with a middle finger, laughing loud enough to echo off the palace walls. "Semper this, Marine." And that's when Caleb moved. It was one step, just one. But for a man trained to hold the line, that step might as well have been thunder. Nico's expression faltered. "Oh, you can move?" he said with a dry laugh. "What you gonna do?" He didn't finish the sentence. In a blur of motion only a combat veteran could execute, Caleb's legs snapped up. His boot connected squarely with Nico's groin. A precise, punishing kick that lifted the man off the ground. Cameras caught the moment in high definition. Nico's eyes bulging, mouth frozen in a perfect O of shock. He collapsed like a felled tree, landing with a splash, right in the mess he'd made. Gasps turned to stunned silence. A child asked, "Is he dead?" His father replied, "Only his pride." And just like that, Caleb returned to position, as if nothing had happened. Only the gentle sway of his gloves hinted at the power just released. The rest of him was stone, a monument to discipline. People didn't cheer, they didn't need to. There was too much respect in the air for noise. A woman in her 70s wiped her eyes. "He stood still longer than I ever could have," she whispered. One act of quiet strength changed how everyone saw him. As the man lay groaning at Caleb's feet, something shifted, not in Caleb but in everyone else. The murmurs faded, phones lowered, and for a long moment the only sound in the courtyard was the soft clicking of palace security boots approaching from the far gate. Caleb still hadn't moved. He didn't look down at the man he'd kicked. He didn't scan the crowd for reactions. He simply returned to his post, upright and proud, as though nothing had happened. Because for him, nothing had. It was just another duty carried out with precision. But for the onlookers, it wasn't just another moment. It was the moment. That's when people started to see him differently. The same tourists who had snapped casual photos of the statue-like guard now stood with newfound reverence. A retired Air Force pilot visiting with his wife removed his cap and stood at attention. "He waited," the man said, voice thick with emotion. "Waited until that boy crossed the line, and then, boom. That's training. That's control." A teenage girl who had been filming slowly lowered her phone. "He's not just a guard," she said quietly. "He's a soldier." A young father knelt beside his son. "Do you see now why we respect uniforms?" he asked. His boy nodded solemnly. And then there was Mrs. Langford. 84 years old, widow of a Korean War veteran, she stood near the center of the crowd. She had come to Buckingham Palace for nostalgia, for history. But what she witnessed gave her something much more real. She stepped forward, cane in one hand, dignity in the other, and softly said, "He didn't do that out of anger, he did it out of duty." Her words settled over the crowd like a benediction. The mood changed. There was no outrage, no shouts for accountability. Instead, there was an understanding, a silent agreement that what Caleb had done was necessary, earned, and justified. And maybe that was the true moment of transformation. Not for Caleb, he had always known who he was, but for everyone else who now saw what real restraint looked like. They saw the difference between performative power and authentic discipline, between ego and honor. When the two palace security officers finally reached the scene, they didn't draw weapons. They didn't ask Caleb what happened. They simply looked at Nico, now curled up and whimpering, and one officer muttered, "Bet he learned his lesson." The other turned to Caleb. "Evening, sir." Caleb gave no reply. Stillness was still his strongest statement. But the crowd? They knew what had been said without a word. In that moment, Buckingham Palace didn't just feel like a symbol of tradition. It felt like sacred ground, not because of the bricks or flags, but because of one man who reminded everyone watching what it means to wear a uniform and stand for something greater than yourself. Sometimes, doing the right thing opens doors you never asked for, but always deserved. In the days following the incident, Caleb Whitaker became a quiet legend. There were no press releases, no official statements. The palace declined to comment, and Caleb, true to form, remained silent. But the moment had already escaped the stone walls of Buckingham Palace and traveled far beyond. Someone's camera footage went viral. Within 48 hours, the video had over 2 million views on YouTube. Comments poured in from veterans, families, and patriots around the world. Some called it the most dignified act of defense they'd ever seen. Others simply wrote, "Thank you for standing your ground." News outlets reached out. Veteran associations shared the story. A retired general from Virginia posted, "Discipline under pressure is the mark of a true warrior. That man didn't just protect the honor of a uniform, he reminded the world what it means." But the most powerful response came not from media or crowds, but from those who had served. Letters started arriving at the U.S. Embassy and the Royal Guard Command, handwritten, carefully composed. A Marine who served in Iraq wrote, "Khalib reminded me of why I joined and why I still stand tall, even in civilian life." A Gold Star widow sent a photo of her husband's boots with a note that read, "He would have done the same." Back home in Kansas, a local VFW chapter painted a mural of Caleb's silhouette on their wall, boots planted, still as stone. The caption read, "Honor stands still until it must move." 1 week later, Caleb received a discreet summons. Inside the palace, behind thick oak doors, he stood before senior members of the Guard and a special U.S. liaison. They didn't scold him, they didn't praise him. They thanked him. "You reminded the world that tradition isn't passive," said one official. "It's defended." A proposal followed, one that caught Caleb off guard. He was offered a position as a military cultural liaison, a transatlantic role representing honor and military tradition through events, education, and symbolic duty. It wouldn't involve politics or fanfare, just purpose. Caleb hesitated. He hadn't acted for recognition. But the offer wasn't about him. It was about using his moment to inspire others, especially young people who didn't understand what quiet strength looked like. A few days later, Caleb stood again at the gates of Buckingham Palace, not as a silent sentry, but as a living bridge between generations, between nations, and between ceremony and substance. Tourists now looked at him differently. They didn't wave or pose for selfies. They nodded, respectfully. Sometimes a fellow veteran would stop and exchange a silent salute. It wasn't fame he'd earned. It was trust. And with that came the opportunity to turn one sharp, powerful moment into a lasting reminder. Dignity isn't loud. Justice doesn't always wear a badge, and sometimes the man who says nothing teaches us the loudest lesson of all. True growth isn't loud. It's revealed in silence and forged in moments that test your soul. Weeks passed. The weather at Buckingham Palace turned colder. The wind cut sharper through the trees, and tourists bundled up tighter as they walked the grounds. But Caleb Whitaker stood with the same quiet stillness, his presence now deeper than ever. The man who once came to London simply to serve out his final years in quiet dignity was no longer invisible. Yet with recognition came something unexpected: reflection. For the first time in years, Caleb found himself thinking about the past, not just the uniform, but what it had cost. He thought about comrades he'd lost, about moments in foreign deserts where silence had saved lives, and how now, in peacetime, silence had spoken louder than any bullet ever could. Every time a young soldier passed and saluted, every time a child whispered, "That's the guy!" Caleb realized he was no longer just standing guard for tradition. He was standing for those who could no longer stand at all. That shift changed him. He began to take deeper notice of those around him. New guards in training, tourists with military pins on their jackets, old veterans sitting quietly on benches with faraway stares. Caleb began speaking to them after his shifts. Brief words, nothing dramatic, but enough. He shared small stories, not about war, about discipline, about holding the line when no one's watching, about what it means to be a guardian of something larger than yourself. He was invited to speak to military cadets from both the UK and US embassies. At first, he declined. "I'm no speaker," he said. But then one young American recruit looked him in the eye and asked, "Sir, how do you stay so calm under pressure?" That moment changed everything. Caleb didn't give them tactics. He didn't talk about combat. He simply told the truth. You don't stand still because you're weak. You stand still because the people behind you deserve better than your reaction. But when that line gets crossed, when what you wear is being trampled on, you don't flinch, you don't hesitate, you act, and then you stand again. Those words rippled further than he expected. Soon, Caleb became a mentor in silence. Guards began to imitate not just his posture but his mindset. Officers noted how morale among younger recruits began to rise, not out of fear, but out of a renewed sense of purpose. He wasn't just modeling physical discipline anymore, he was modeling emotional strength. And yet Caleb remained humble. He kept polishing his boots before every shift. He checked his medals for alignment. He held his rifle with reverence. Because in his heart he wasn't a hero, he was just a soldier doing his job. But the truth is, he had become more than that. He had become a living reminder that real courage is quiet, that strength isn't in power, it's in restraint, and that sometimes the greatest growth happens not in battlefields, but in moments where a man chooses silence until silence is no longer enough. There are men who carry rifles and there are men who carry meaning. Caleb Whitaker was both. On a quiet Sunday morning, just before the gates opened to tourists, Caleb arrived early for his post. The chill in the London air was sharper than usual. Frost kissed the stones of the courtyard, and the Union Jack above fluttered softly in the wind. Caleb stood alone for a few moments before assuming his position. He looked up at the sky, not searching for anything but simply remembering. That day marked exactly 40 years since he first wore a uniform. Not the polished one he wore now, but the rough, sweat-stained fatigues of a young Marine shipped off to a world far from home. He had been 19. His parents had cried at the bus stop. He had pretended not to. Now, 6 decades into life and a lifetime into service, Caleb realized something rare. He wasn't just still standing. He had finally become what every young soldier dreams of, a man who never let the uniform wear him. And that, perhaps, was the greatest victory. As the day unfolded, tourists arrived in waves. Some smiled, some nodded respectfully. A few American veterans approached slowly, recognizing him not from viral videos, but from the posture, the unmistakable weight of discipline in his stance. One man in particular, Earl, shuffled toward the front line. He was in his late 80s, hunched with time, his cane worn smooth by decades of use. His Korean War veteran hat sat firmly on his head, and his steps, though slow, were deliberate. He stood before Caleb for a long moment, saying nothing. Then, without warning, he raised his trembling hand in a salute, sharp and proud, as though his bones remembered what age had tried to erase. Caleb saw it from the corner of his eye. Regulations said he shouldn't respond, but Caleb was never one to obey when respect demanded more than rules. He returned the salute. Earl's eyes filled with tears. "Semper Fi, son," he said softly. That moment, quiet as it was, echoed louder than applause. Later that evening, as the sun dipped behind the towers, Caleb removed his gloves and walked the long stone path back to the quarters. As he passed the memorial wall for fallen guards, he stopped. It had become something of a ritual, a silent nod to those who stood before him. He reached into his coat and pulled out a small, folded piece of cloth, a handkerchief his wife had embroidered with the words, "Hold the line." She had passed 5 years earlier, cancer, quick, unfair. She had always told him, "You were made for moments no one sees." Now the world had seen him, and she wasn't here to share it. His eyes burned. He let them. A week later, he was invited to speak, not at a military academy or a government event, but at a retirement home. The director had reached out after watching his story and said, "Most of our residents are veterans. Some feel forgotten. Would you come?" Caleb said yes. When he walked into the common room, a dozen men looked up, some in wheelchairs, others in silence. Most had no visitors, some hadn't spoken in days. Caleb didn't give a speech. He just sat among them and started a conversation. One man, who hadn't spoken in 3 weeks, leaned forward when Caleb mentioned standing post for 9 hours straight. "Zek," the man said with a weak grin, I once went 14 with a sprained ankle and Sergeant never let me live it down. Laughter followed, the kind that sounds like healing. For the first time, Caleb realized that his kick hadn't just silenced a drunk. It had awakened something in men who thought the world had forgotten them. Honor, pride, brotherhood. Later that evening, one of the nurses pulled Caleb aside and whispered, "You gave them something today we couldn't. You gave them back their edge." Caleb just nodded. That was enough. By the end of the month, he returned to duty at the gates. Tourists still snapped photos, but now they looked longer. They paused. Not because he was viral, because he was vital. And when asked by a young officer what he hoped his legacy would be, Caleb said, "That someone sees me standing still and remembers that stillness doesn't mean surrender. It means self-control, earned the hard way." That winter, as snow dusted the rooftops of Buckingham Palace, an engraved plaque was quietly installed on the inner wall of the guardhouse. It bore no fancy language, just a simple quote beneath his name, "Moved only when he had to." And when he did, he reminded the world why we stand. When silence no longer serves justice, action must speak with precision. Let's take a moment to ask the question many of us quietly wondered while watching Caleb Whitaker stand his ground outside Buckingham Palace. What would you have done if you were the guard? Not just wearing a uniform, but carrying the weight of 4 decades of service. And a man walked up to you, laughed in your face, and relieved himself on your boots. What would your reaction be? Would you yell? Would you strike out in rage? Would you stay still and let it go? Most people believe they'd hold their ground. Some think they'd lash out immediately. But the truth is, very few could do what Caleb did. Because what Caleb showed us isn't just military discipline, it's life discipline. The kind forged over time, the kind tested in silence, the kind that doesn't rush to react, but waits for the right moment, then acts with measured purpose. And that's the real life lesson. In our everyday lives, we may not be guards standing outside a palace, but we all face moments where we're tested. At work, in relationships, in public. Someone cuts you off in traffic. A coworker disrespects you. A stranger hurls words that sting. And the world watches to see how you'll respond. The easy route is to explode, but explosions burn everyone, including yourself. The harder route is to hold steady, to stay rooted in who you are until the line is truly crossed. And when that line is crossed, to respond not with rage, but with clarity. That's what Caleb taught us. He didn't kick because he was angry. He kicked because that moment, that singular vile act, demanded a response that words would never deliver. A response that would restore dignity without destroying his own. It was swift, it was clean, it was enough. And then, he stood still again. Just like in life, there's a time to act, and a time to return to peace. For many of you watching, especially those who've worn the uniform or loved someone who did, Caleb's story hits deep. It reminds us of a generation that didn't post online when disrespected. They simply waited for the right moment. To remind the world that honor isn't an idea, it's a posture. It's a line you guard, even when others cross it. So ask yourself, if you were in Caleb's position, what would you have done? Would you have waited? Would you have moved? Would you have responded at all? Leave your answer in the comments below. Rate this story from 1 to 10 and tell us what moment struck you the most. And if this story moved you, even just a little, please hit that like button. It helps more people discover real stories of honor and service. Drop a comment below, especially if you're a veteran, family of service members, or someone who believes self-control is real strength. Subscribe to Guard Royals and help us reach our next milestone, 1,000 subscribers who still believe in dignity, legacy, and the power of standing still when the world demands reaction. Because the world doesn't need more noise. It needs more Calebs. And maybe, just maybe, you've got a little bit of Caleb in you too. Final quote to reflect on. You don't always choose the battle, but you always choose the standard you uphold when it begins.